we crave unknowing. We crave to enter worlds that we're not familiar with and discover. We need that sense of discovery. We need that sense of unfamiliarity of the exotic. You're looking in places where people don't look because that's where the signal is going to come through. The signal isn't going to come through at a cathedral or wherever. The signal is going to come through where nobody expects it, so it can't be intercepted.
In this episode, Synchromystic raconteur and culture shaman Chris Knowles returns to the show, and the show itself returns to the Vancouver seasons of its heart, because we are exploring how the archetypal and the mythic erupt and erupt into modern reality. And the lens for this examination is everyone between the ages of 35 and 45's sexual awakening, regardless of gender, the X-Files. Now, if you haven't seen the show, I would almost say this episode is more for you than it is for the X-Files superfans, because it's not even really about the X-Files. It's about sacred stories and the mythic and how culture can approach the mystery. So enjoy. The Reverend Dr. Christopher Knowles returns to talk to us about the X-Files. And we used to talk about this all the time, Chris. So welcome back.
Yes, thank you. It's been very long. I don't even remember last time I was on your show.
I think it was for the Synchromysticism book, the first one. So yeah, about
so
18
that's not
months.
that long.
No. But we used to talk about X-Files, like when I was in London, long into the night. But, X-Files was 75 years ago, and that was 60 years ago.
So probably, you probably recognize a lot of the things that I was talking about in the book.
I did. And I actually kind of want to start with the sort of annoying for a book question, which is, who is it for and why now?
Well, why now? Because it was now or never.
Okay.
Just kind of felt like I wanted to get it out 2 years ago, but just it wasn't going to happen. So I got it out this year, and who's it for? People like us. It's not for your meat and potatoes X-Files fan, because I don't even think they read books anymore.
This is why it's a leading question is I'm not sure they exist, and that's good, if that makes sense. Like the vicissitudes of the show have burned off a lot of the dross that inevitably such an archetypally powerful product kind of constellated around it. So yeah, I was looking at it thinking there is now here we are at the end of Western civilization, and there's maybe 15, 20 shows. Let's say 15 shows that you quote unquote should watch. And one of my questions later on is going to be, is this the best show ever made in the English language? But you will, because it's been a few decades, meet people who haven't seen it or might have seen one or two and might be vaguely in the background, oh, I'm low-key interested. I've been meaning to get to that, meaning to get to The Sopranos. And it's I wonder if this book isn't, this is a very good idea, because TV, like everything else, continues its terminal decline into dross. We're past the golden age of television. So this is a very good investment in your time. Take this book, watch the episode, then read, and go through. And it's you're in some sort of initiation. That's my impressions reading it. What do you think?
Yeah, it's almost like I'm creating a grimoire for watching X-Files. People aren't watching it right. Is the main thrust of my argument. There's so much going on that people just are completely oblivious to. And I only thought it was sporting to sort of point it out, since everybody works so hard and putting all that strange stuff in there and all those layers of meaning and subtext and so on and so forth and suggestions. So, if they went to all the trouble to put it there, somebody should at least point it out to people, because I haven't really been involved in X-Files fandom, but I've kind of been following it for, ever since the beginning. And people just they don't know what they're watching. And that's, I mean, even people, I'm always surprised by people who are sort of in our world, in our little sphere, who never saw it. I'm like, how did you never watch the X-Files? It's like, how can you be into like UFOs or whatever and never watch the X-Files, or, cultism or whatever? And like, how does that happen? It's like, so I really wanted to, so who am I writing this book for? I'm writing this book for people, involved in our little part of the world, um, who may have watched it back in the day but haven't watched it in a long time, or maybe they never watched it. And I want to give them some context for what they're actually looking at. And whatever you can say about Chris Carter, you can't say that he's not like a completely fractal thinker whose mind works on several different levels all at once, sometimes to his detriment. I mean, I think that's sort of his tragic flaw as well. I mean, I think he just has too much stuff going on inside his head, and so I wanted to show people like what they're watching, and
Yeah.
particularly with all the ancient mythological allegory, which I think people might have some sort of sense of, but not to the sense that I really dug it up.
Yeah.
So.
And I definitely want to get to that. It's funny you mentioned Chris Carter now, because my 3 bullet point questions in the Chris Carter section is: Chris Carter, does he give any fucks? What mission was he on beyond making a good show? And I think about that in the sense of the amount of really good episodes that I didn't know almost didn't get made, that you learn about in this book. That he's like,
Mm,
oh no, I'm putting my absolute foot down. This particular episode about like a goo must get made. It's like,
mm,
all right, like today, we're not in the age of like the great visionary showrunners. So usually
mm,
it'll just be like, yes, Netflix, whatever you say, Netflix is kind of more
mm,
how it
yeah,
goes. But
yeah.
here's this guy who, as you say, is obviously like brilliant and a fractal thinker, but kind of Lynchian in his refusal to be like, well, this is exactly what this is exactly what this is about. So did he give
Mm.
any fucks, and what mission was he on?
I think he wanted to put the best show on the air that he could. I mean, he very much cared about how the show was produced, straight down the line. People have no idea. I mean, that guy would be out at his desk at like 7 o'clock in the morning and leave at like midnight or after midnight. So, I mean, he was there before everybody and he stayed till long after everybody left the offices. So he definitely gave a fuck about that. Today, I think I compared him to Jack Kirby because Jack Kirby sort of reached a point in the 70s where he didn't give a fuck. He was just going to do what he was going to do. He was going to say what he wanted to say and let the stones fall where they may. And I think that's sort of the point where Carter ended up at, just realizing that there's no margin in trying to please Hollywood anymore. There's no Hollywood to please anymore, to be honest
That's
with you.
true. Yeah.
So
Yeah. The
go ahead.
Jack Kirby thing was really like, that was on point because I was reading it, and obviously I watched a few episodes, rewatched, but watched a few episodes. And I'm like, oh yeah, and we'll talk about them in a minute when we get to the episode section. But holy shit, because it's been the last X Files I watched would have been the final season, right? 10,
Hmm.
and
Hmm. 11.
when you talk about the visual difference between Vancouver and LA for people who are
Hmm.
unaware, the show moved, and that each episode in Vancouver was like a film, was like a mini like film, and then it becomes network TV, visually speaking, once you hit LA. And there's some good in that, like, but it's not. Holy shit! Was this like film school, like Lynchian in the first few
Yeah.
seasons? When you talk about the stuff that Carter put in, it's layered like Lynch layers. And here's how I think about it. It's like if Robert Anton Wilson, not annoying Robert Anton Wilson, and Lynch were a kid, because you can step into the X Files world like you can step into Bob Wilson stuff, but it's being explained to you or demonstrated to you by Lynch, and it's this amazing portal opening up into the the high strange, the more than human, whatever you want to call it, and
Mm.
especially in those first few seasons, like how did this get on TV? What the hell was going on?
Well, how it got on TV is that they're on a network that didn't have a lot else to put on. Um, we're just trying to fill up the schedule. And when they noticed that like people online, which is brand new, we're getting excited about it. That's kind of what saved the show because the ratings were pretty poor in the first season. So it's kind of like there's a real freedom to when people aren't really paying attention to what you're doing. It's just you're there to provide product no matter what, and they just need somebody to fill up that 45 minutes of airtime. And I've noticed throughout like independent film and comic, any kind of art form where people aren't really paying attention to it, that's when interesting things happen. It's when,
Hmm.
the focus is so tight and the expectations are so high. And I think that's what happened in the series later on in its run. I actually had just met Frank Spotnitz last weekend before, and he had said, he was saying that like after a while, the show becomes about itself, and
Yeah,
that's
it's
a
so good.
real, that's kind of like a real unpleasant place for a showrunner to be because you've done X amount of episodes. How do you just keep pulling those rabbits out of the hat? Because
Mhm.
if you really look back in history, there weren't a lot of shows of that nature that had lasted that long. I mean, Star Trek: The Next Generation was 7 seasons. Buffy was 7 seasons. You had a lot of shows that barely made a full season. Um, there wasn't a lot of precedent for a show that was dealing with these kind of topics to run that long. I mean, Twilight Zone was only 5 seasons. Outer Limits was only two. Invaders was only two. Kolchak was only one. So you had this unprecedented situation, which I kind of, I feel for that because I've been in situations, you worked in the publishing business and the rest. I mean, you know what it's like when you just have to produce something,
Mm.
whether you have the ideas or not, whether you feel like it or not, it has to get done. And that's a very difficult place creatively to find yourself in. But I think the ancient mythological stuff was a real driving force from very early on. And also, I talk quite a bit about all the mushrooms and the
Yeah, yeah,
LSD
yeah.
and the iboga and, all these things that show up rather explicitly. I mean, Chris Carter was a surfer
I was about to say the
in the,
California Surfer comes out there. Yeah.
yeah, in the 70s. I mean, and he even said, there were certain, what did he say? There were certain rituals that needed to be attended to. There were certain sacraments that you needed to honor in that culture, meaning, you sit around with a bunch of surfers and they're like dropping acid, you better get ready to drop acid too. So I think that had a huge impact on the series, which I think, how many people watch that show have had experience with psychedelics? Probably not a lot.
Mm.
So that's another layer of meaning that I think people are missing. So,
Well, and I one of the episodes I rewatched was Field Trip, which for people who are unaware is the story of Mulder in particular, but like both of them ultimately actually accidentally being digested by a carnivorous psychedelic fungus that traps people in these different visions and so on. And
mm.
it's Inception before Inception. Like I'd forgot about the twist ending, and I'm like, oh yeah, man, that's really good. But it's also I want to talk about the structure of the show, and then I want to come back to that because I want to talk about what we think quote unquote X Files is about, or like I hate to say it's too Lynchian to say this is the message, and I think that's where people miss it. When I watched it, I was a kid, and I really wanted it to just be like, just fucking tell me what aliens are. Just fucking one of these episodes, we're gonna find out exactly what's going on, and the show is literally the opposite. The point of it is the opposite of that, right?
I see. I
So
don't think it is about aliens. You know,
exactly,
I,
exactly. But
I
as a
I
kid, I
wrote,
did. Yeah.
yeah. I think it's more about alternate states of reality and looking for meaning within those. Extraordinary experience.
Yeah. I think the
And that
show.
episode Field Trip is such a great example because I see that almost as like a statement of purpose. This is the revelation. This is what the show is really about. And if you notice, like the mushroom is underground, just like the black oil is underground, and the black oil takes you over and changes your personality. And I mean, and then the next episode after Field Trip, Mulder is, affected. The black oil in his system is activated by the alien tablets owned by Dr. Sandoz. I mean, come on. I mean,
Exactly.
how much more on the
Exactly.
head does it have to get,
Yeah, and in Field Trip, it's a sacred UFO, or historic UFO, high strange site called Brown Mountain with rainbows in the
hmm
sky. It's a world
hmm
mountain, so like it is. This is a really good example of Carter like stacking and not
It's the
telling you. And I
follows.
was
Yeah.
yeah, I was a kid, so I was waiting for the episode where Cancer Man comes in and says, "Oh, this is actually what's happening, and this and this and this." But the show is literally. I was watching it through. It's about perception and remaining humble, like before your inability to understand, because like at the core you have in theory a skeptic and a believer attempting to understand reality, but it's not just that, because everyone fails in the face of the mystery. Like the
Mm.
Anglo-American elite fails. Everyone who seeks to like come to understand the mystery doesn't. And that's like a real actual like wise California surfer Lynchian thing. Like the show is about, yes, the cosmos is strange and wondrous, and you will just fail. You will just fail to like get a hold of it, and you'll get caught
Yeah.
in your own mental system, right? And I think it's wonderful.
Well, I think that Carter not only came out of that surfing culture, but he was coming up in Hollywood at a time when everything was about like the hero's journey and um,
Yeah.
Joseph Campbell. Everything was about archetypes. Everything was about mythic allegory. I mean, you remember those days, right? In
Hmm.
the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, that stuff was, and that's when he's coming up, and that stuff is very much, it's trying to like find meaning, you know, in the trash stratum, really. It's very PKD in that sense, where you're looking in places where people don't look because that's where the signal is going to come through. The signal isn't going to come through at a cathedral or wherever. The signal is going to come through where nobody expects it, so it can't be intercepted,
Yeah,
so to
that's
speak.
wonderful.
Yeah,
This time
and
around, after your book, I've been sitting with the mandala of the famous "I Want to Believe" poster, because
mm,
I want to believe is a statement in the direction of your perceptions are going to inform the experience or the reality you have. And there are multiple instances in the show where that indeed is what happens. But it's these words are pasted on a picture of like a faked UFO. Like this
yeah.
is not a real UFO. I want to believe this fakeness. There's like you can come at this mandala from five different directions, and that's the X Files to me. That's the you're not gonna. That is the answer. The answer is like this. Like you, I want to believe this is. It's
Well, I'll
anything.
tell you an
It's
interesting story. Let me tell you an interesting story because I'm glad you brought that up because the original image on that was one of the Billy Meyer photos.
really.
Are you familiar with Billy Meyer from
Yeah.
Switzerland?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they had actually got sued for it too because they used it without permission. They had to, change it to just a generic UFO that they made themselves. But when you look at Billy Meyer and you look at the lineage that he comes from, I mean, I did a whole live stream on like the Space Brothers and this whole neo-theosophical notion that these beings were all saviors, starting with people like Adamski and George Hunt Williamson and all the rest of them, George Van Tassel, George King, all the Georges, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and that sort of led into Maitreya in the 70s and 80s, that whole thing with Maitreya and Benjamin Creme. You remember him? So it's all coming. See, that's what I'm saying. It's like it's all being pulled, whether you realize it or not, from this very rich and loamy and weird culture that's been roiling under the surface for at least 80 years now, right? Since Roswell and Kenneth Arnold and everything, and how in the starting as soon as those things were seen, that your occultists and your theosophical types really almost immediately glommed onto the UFOs. Like this is it. This is it. Like what's her name? Marjorie Cameron said, these are Crowley's war engines from Lever Al. That's this is. I mean, this is the fulfillment of that prophecy, and the fact that the ghost rockets were seen during, they started being seen during the Babylon working and so on. So you can't separate like the occult and the esoteric from the UFO stuff, and then you bring in like the intelligence agencies, and they're all just completely besotted with occultism as well. And then you start bringing in all the MK Ultra stuff, and you start to look at like what Sidney Gottlieb was really like, and he was just a very strange dude who sort of fancied himself a wizard. So you can't separate all the subtext. I mean, people will make films and TV shows sort of glossing over this history. And that's why I front loaded the book with that history, like,
Yeah.
okay, let's just stop before we even get into this. Let's look at this history, with Kenneth Arnold and Maury Island and invasion of Washington and Roswell and Aztec and all these things, all of which were at one time or another referenced in the show. But I think that people believe the conceit, right? They believe the conceit that this is about metal objects from other galaxies invading our Earth, when I don't think it's ever been about that. It's always been like a manifestation of the occult. And you and I used to talk about Vallée and Keel and so on, and that was our understanding. That this wasn't like some sort of scientific materialistic invasion. This was something completely different, and that's really what I wanted to, again, like bring up first. Like, okay, before we get started, let's look at this history so we know what the background is. But also all the human experimentation, starting well before MK Ultra.
Yeah. It's like one of the episodes I rewatched was Jose Chung, and they give basically those lines to Jesse Ventura saying, wait a minute. Your sense organs think that you think you know what you saw with those sense organs in a cosmos that's like this, and you can say confidently, I know what I saw, and it's a flying saucer from space. And it's just this like almost a mission statement of like, hold up. You with your little monkey senses think you know what. Yeah, I loved that. I thought that was really cool. One of the things I think this is
That's a
the
great episode.
it's one of the best. Like in the book, it's really interesting to see the ones that were your favorites. And Christmas Carol, it's a great episode, but it didn't make it super high on my list. Not that it was bad, but mine's like Jose Chung, Anasazi, Closure, like sort of expected ones, I suppose. But yeah, you had some surprise curveballs in there.
Well, Christmas Carol reminds me so much of my own family. I
Okay.
know what it's like to sort of come up in like these military oriented families, and how people behave, and everything is always suppressed, and don't say that all. I just the whole family dynamic was just so real to me. I'm not exactly sure who put that in there, but I'm glad you brought up Closure too, because that's the whole thing with the walk-ins, and I think that that's where it got closer to maybe where Carter's thinking really is.
I do too. Yeah.
Yeah, and because we saw it. There's an episode in the first season, Space, which is sort of a derided episode, unfairly, I think, but it's like an astronaut who goes up into orbit and is possessed by Martian space demons, basically. So, and that's really early on. So it's like that's the whole thing. It's like unreliable narrator is a constant theme in these stories, but I think when you really get down to it, the actual phenomenon itself, I think, is seen in more mystical terms.
Yeah, it lives in the
And
starlight. Yeah.
yes, exactly. Thank
The
you.
um, what the unreliable narrator I understood way more this time watching these few episodes after reading your book. To the point that I'm like, is this the main character? Like, is this actually what the show is about? Because it comes back to that perception thing of like strange stuff is happening all around you, but you just you were, but you were definitionally unreliable in your attempt to tell it. And the funny thing, watching Closure again last night, always good to cry yourself to sleep once a month. Um, when Mulder gets back from the, well, we're not, if you haven't seen it by now, the show is 80 years old. Come on, Amelia Earhart was in it. Like, when he gets back from witnessing his sister amongst the spirits of the walk-ins at the very end of Closure, I was aware of the unreliable narrator now because he comes back with 100% confidence. He's like, "Oh, my sister's dead. Your son is dead. They're in a better place, but they're dead." And it's like, actually, that's first of all, I just watched Anasazi, and your dead dad in the land of the dead said your sister isn't amongst you, and you literally just definitionally saw all these kids, these spirit kids, who had actually not died. Obviously, they're not coming back to Earth, but he's like, they're dead. It's not coming back. My sister's dead. It's all done. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's not actually, I'm not convinced that that's exactly what happened. But that's unreliable narrator stuff. It's like what he actually got out of it was closure. And it's like a Mulder human attempt to frame something that we're just not going to get. I thought it was really good.
Well, 'cause, the whole, I guess the MacGuffin. I mean, it's all about the psychic, and
Yeah.
seeing, and he's incredibly damaged. So is he reliable? Um, I've often seen, those two episodes, and the whole thing with the walk-ins is that it's just a cope, for these
Yeah.
parents who've lost their children, and they can't accept it. It's too painful. And, maybe having this experience, you hear a lot about some people who have paranormal or, spiritual experiences that they can become sort of liberating, like something, a question they didn't know to ask is answered, or just like this weight is lifted from their shoulders, and they don't exactly know why. But I mean, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
The paranormal literature, high weirdness, high strangeness. I mean, it's filled with those kind of revelations. So that's again, these writers were incredibly smart people, and they were constantly they had like literal libraries of the occult and paranormal and conspiracy, and they were always just pulling that in because to be frank, it's like these days, you talked about Netflix. I mean, Netflix can take 2 or 3 years to do 6 episodes.
I know.
Back then you had 9 months to do 24 episodes.
And
So
then 3 months off and you do it again. None of this taking 2 years off between seasons.
yeah. I don't know how they did it back then,
Yeah. I
but
don't know how they do it now. Like Critical Drinker had a video that came out last week or the week before saying that nothing's going on in Hollywood, like nothing. So why does it
yeah,
take 2 years to come back to make 6 episodes? No one's busy. Like what's happening? And it's true. Yeah.
I think a lot of that might be scheduling. But again, you worked in publishing. I mean, you know that like things will be done sometimes a year or two before they're
Yeah.
actually released. Whether it's a movie or record, TV show, book, magazine. So the actual release date isn't always reflective of the completion, let's just say. But I think today we have a very, I think, a terminal problem where there's just not a lot left. There's not a lot of virgin territory story-wise. There aren't a lot of new stories to tell that are going to have a mass appeal. I mean, sure, there are any number of books published every day, but are those stories going to appeal to people? It's a very difficult balancing act where you want to say something new, but people want something familiar.
Mm.
And like I
They
said,
crave something familiar. That's that archetypal pull. I mean, this is how you can constellate a fandom around you of like vicious idiots who don't even know, they don't even know what's so important, like what the actual thing that's drawing them in is. Like they don't even know that it's this, as you talk about, like the resonance to ancient mysteries, like stories that we the last few centuries have been denied. Like this used to be our lineage, our heritage, to be, taken through life with these archetypes, and then all of a sudden they show up, and it's like water in the desert, but you don't know it.
well, I think one of the problems is that a lot of the people, myself included, it took me a long time to realize that we had this huge explosion of really interesting and new stories in the 50s and 60s. Because why? Because of the war. So many of the people that were writing these kind of revolutionary new forms of drama, really, were in the war. I mean, I had read that I had actually read a biography on Rod Serling, and the whole idea for the Twilight Zone came to him because he was in the South Pacific. He was in combat, and they were waiting for this. They parachute in supplies and everything. So this shipment was coming in by parachute, and it landed on like one of his friends. And he was just so struck by the absolute absurdity of that. It's like
Yeah.
they're in this precarious situation. They're sort of hemmed in by the enemy. They need supplies. The supplies come, except for something goes wrong and it lands on one of his buddies. And like just the absolute, I don't want to say paradox, but I think kind of the absurdity of that. And Gene Roddenberry had been in two plane crashes, um, one during the war and one as a airline pilot. Jack Kirby had been sent behind enemy lines, because they found out he could draw, and they sent him behind enemy lines to sketch out, the lay of the land. So all these kind of experiences were really the birth of these stories, I think. Chris Carter surfing. Surfing is a very dangerous sport. I don't know if you've ever done it down
Mhm.
there in Oz, in the land of Oz, but
Our
people,
surfers are a lot dumber than Chris Carter, let me tell you. But yes.
but people die. I mean, I remember my wife and I, this back 40 years ago now, my father lived on the ocean, and, there was this little island you could swim out to across the street from his house. And we were sitting on the jetty, and there was a water skier. And, we watched him get killed. Um, and that's just water skiing.
Mm.
So people who deal with danger are going to have stories to tell about it, I think.
Yeah. If
Um,
you, this is coming back to the being humble before the mystery. If you want to find someone who is humble before the mystery, it's a surfer because no, truly, like especially in Australia, you sit out there with your delicious legs dangling in the water so that the unconscious can get you at any moment. And you are there not at all in control, but delighting
mm,
in the process of flowing with the cosmos when it happens in an ecstatic movement that might kill you. Right? Like you don't know. You don't know what wave you're gonna get. You don't know how many sharks are underneath you. It is a
mm,
sacred unknowing. And there's something. This is like the genius surfer element. Like if you think about the movement through, you do your best. Like the syndicate is a surfboard. Scully, Mulder. Like I'm gonna try and get through the cosmos. Not get through the cosmos, but be in the cosmos. And but the cosmos is in charge. Is a very surfer analogy or a very surfer perspective. It sort of occurred to me reading through your book this time.
well, surfing is like it's my go-to metaphor for mysticism.
Mm.
Like what's the difference between mysticism and magic? Like magic is kind of building a boat, and surfing is just like, I mean, mysticism is kind of like just jumping into the water with your surfboard and surrendering yourself to the elements, come what may. Um, you know, we both spend a lot of time in the ocean, so we understand it. We understand the power of the ocean. We understand how easily you can go from just having a lovely old day to swimming to the sirens, so to
Yeah.
speak. There's that precarity is balanced by the beauty, and I think that's just a really wonderful metaphor for mysticism.
Exactly why. That's exactly it, right? Like in an early morning, real good shark time, but an early morning when it's warm and the sun is out, it's so good. It's so
Yeah.
good. It's like the cosmos is so good. Are you going to get eaten? I mean, it's not actually your first thought, but it's kind of there. And yeah, that's this to me. I didn't realize this time through, or I only didn't watch the whole thing. I just watched a bunch of episodes inspired by the book. But I see more of that now. And his
Mm.
intelligence. So we're coming back to closure. Like the first episode is named for a Heidegger book. It's
Mm.
Being and Time, talking about these guys being really smart and having lots of books. So like Sein und Zeit, what's your best take as to why they called the first episode of like the walk-in arc after Heidegger's Being and Time? What do you think? What am I missing there?
I gave up a long time ago trying to figure that dude out. He just, again, he's got a fractal brain. His brain works on levels that,
Yeah.
maybe a lot of us aren't really privy to or even able to access. I've told you in the past the DVD commentary, the director's commentary on the episode Improbable, which is basically all about synchronicity and pattern recognition. And if you listen to the director's commentary, I mean, it sounds almost like orthodox Neoplatonism. I mean, the whole thing, I remember we discussed it, and you said his thinking was medieval, which I thought was a
Yeah.
very powerful, a very powerful way to put it. That it is a medieval thinking where the world is not what we had after the Industrial Revolution and Darwinism and all these kind of things. It was a world that we belonged to and had mysteries for us that were greater than even what we could even imagine.
Yes.
And
It
that there were
contains the
signs, there were always signs along the way to point you in the proper direction. And I mean, that's as good a definition of synchromysticism as I can
agreed.
imagine, right?
Agreed.
I mean, it's just
Yeah. I think it was in the
so
same conversation because it was about 10 or more years ago. This idea has lived rent free in my head. You were sort of thinking out loud, but it's a justifiable position. I want to talk about the movies of the week episodes and the myth arc now. But once you said to me, the movies of the week episodes is the myth arc, like that's
mm,
actually the X Files. And the book doesn't say anything like that. It was a thinking out loud comment, but that stayed in my head because it kind of is. Like the
didn't I
actual
didn't
myth.
say that in as many words. I thought I thought I did.
Yeah, true, you did, but because it is like it is an elaboration on a Chris Carterian cosmos, right? Like it and I guess this is the being and time aspect of it, like to be in a cosmos where these things happen. And for me, this is my take on it anyway. And the myth arc is different attempts to understand and warnings against weaponizing or understing too much
Yeah,
the
like there's a
things
kind
the
of
things that
gnosis
are
there.
given
Yeah.
to mankind. Yeah, yeah.
Mm, yeah. Well, you've always talked about the Tower of Babel being a cautionary tale, like maybe the things we shouldn't know or we shouldn't act upon. And that's probably a pretty solid through line throughout the mythology. Like, yes, we have access to these tools and these technologies and everything, but should we use them? And could they ever be used properly? Could they ever be used for non-evil ends, let's just say? And, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, this is nothing unique to the show, but I think that I'm really interested, though, in this whole thing with Hyder, because I remember when I had gone to see you at the Guggenheim with Diane Pasulka, and she was talking a lot about Heidegger. Like Heidegger was a big sort of turning point for her interested in UFOs, which I still haven't been able to retrace those steps. Like how do you go from Heidegger to hanging out with like sketchy NASA guys in the middle of the desert somewhere looking for memory metals, right? I don't know. I don't know how that. I still don't know how that happened. But there is that precedent, right? That precedent with sign and sight. So again, I mean, there are people who just it's not a better or worse thing. It doesn't make them any more exalted than us or whatever, but their minds just operate on levels that we really don't have access to. And they're very rare. I mean, I think these people are very rare. I mean, think of people like Isaac Newton or Einstein or whomever, people who just were able to see things in ways that seemed so clear to them and just were completely opaque to everyone else. And I think this is also a through line in a lot of spiritual systems as well.
Absolutely.
People like Jung and Philip K. Dick, and people who could look at things that we took for granted and see this kind of numinosity within them. And then, like, once they point it out, you're like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
okay, I see that. I mean, we need these people. I think there are fewer and fewer of these people as the days go by. I don't see a lot of them coming up in sort of the younger generations that have been so heavily programmed by online media and so on. I mean, you need to have an attention span to sort of work these things out. If you don't have an attention span, which I was just reading today that like the average attention span is like 8.5 seconds now,
Wow.
which I'm like, how does that work? I mean, you see teachers complaining that these kids won't even watch like a 5-minute video. So you need to have someone who has the wherewithal to take the time to sort through these things. And we're
There's
seeing less and less of them.
there's an anthropological theory of mind concept known as porosity. And it's
Hmm.
based on the idea that anthropology coming from the West has a really limited or closed understanding of mind, and that actually a
Mm.
mind is porous. And that's expressed and understood elsewhere in the world. We have that in the mystical tradition because Swedenborg would say, like, none of your thoughts or emotions belong to you, actually, that these are
Mm.
inflows from the spirit world. And I think
Hmm.
about Chris Carter as a particularly porous person because not only does his mind work on levels like the I hate calling them Easter eggs. It's such a diminishment, but like the layers of invitation into each episode, that's his mind. But the stuff that got into his mind to end up in the episode, I think he was a very, or is, like, he's not dead. I think he's a very porous man. I think he's very good. And it's just what reminded me was you saying, like, we don't actually have quietude to be porous. We don't actually have
Mm.
the time. Surfing helps with it, but like we don't have the room to be porous to the thought world, the imagination world. And he's like a shaman of porosity, I think.
Well, I think Shaman is right. And, I think Lynch was as well.
Oh, totally.
Um, and the two share a lot in common, but are very much different in a lot of foundational ways. But definitely that kind of ability to go into a realm that we can maybe conceive of, but we can't enter ourselves. And I think a lot of, Philip K. Dick is another great example. These days, I'm really looking forward to seeing where Panos Cosmatos is going to go. People who just have this ability to inhabit the mystery, without sounding too facile. That we're all looking for mystery. We're all looking for things to solve. We all want to look for, we all need things to look forward to, but we all need things to we need new problems to solve. And I think that the problem with our technology being so ubiquitous is not only is it destroying our attention spans, but it's taking away that elusive, nature of reality. If everything can be explained properly or not, through just an AI search, with Gemini on Google, what's the point? But the thing is that everything just becomes a simulacrum. And the thing that I'm really concerned about too is like this whole, and this is something I was thinking about this morning, it's like this whole idea of good enough. We just accept the good enough, the whatever, it will do. It'll do for now. And we don't elevate our expectations, and that to me is not only a technological problem, but I think it's a spiritual malaise that arises from a sense of helplessness in the face of all these technologies. And AI is another discussion completely, but do notice that they were doing AI stories in the very first season. How many people were doing that? Not too many. You could argue that it was being lifted from 2001 or whatever. Fine, but it was certainly in a much different context.
It was, and this comes to the next topic area, and I want to pose a question almost cheekily, but not. Did you learn synchromysticism from the X-Files?
Well, I had been doing a form of it in the, going back to the mid 80s. I didn't know that, I hadn't heard the term synchromysticism until 2005, right? When I discovered people like Jake Coetzee, right? That was a totally new term for me. And it's not even a term I'm always comfortable with, because I think it has a reductionist aspect to it.
Yeah.
When you can go, oh, we're just going to put this in the synchromystic box. Okay, well, what are we going to do with it? And that's a very human impulse, I think. We need to find places. We need to label things and put them in their proper cubby hole, right? And that's one of the misgivings I do have about the term synchromysticism. But as I talk about in the book, the Synchromystic book, I had that really life-changing synchromystic experience, I think the Sunday before the X-Files premiered.
That's right. Yeah.
So, the two are conjoined in very powerful ways for me, So
And I guess,
I don't know if, go ahead.
yeah, the reason I say that is at the beginning of the episode you did with Greg on the X-Files book, you say, and it was really, I should have clipped it. Maybe I will. But it's this really pithy encapsulation of how the X-Files quote unquote works, which is that if you're Chris Carter and you're a really smart person and you can arrange archetypal motifs and culture in certain ways, certain effects and almost like prediction manifestations will happen. And what made me think about that was when you just said, like, they were doing AI in season one, like, yeah, it's kind of riffing on or quote unquote based on HAL in 2001, sure, but it also isn't. And it also isn't because there's something about the X-Files that actually makes it a ritual in the hands of a hyper-competent ritualist, which is you arrange certain ideas and archetypes together and you have effects.
Yeah, and it sort of weaves in and out of the series throughout the history of the series, and that's something I didn't want to get too deep into the weeds with that kind of thing, but it's there are certain episodes that I thought the issue needed to be raised, but again, sort of drawing on what you just said. When I was working on the book, and I didn't put it in, and I feel kind of stupid for not putting it in, but a thought just kept going through my mind. So, when I wrote Our Gods Wear Spandex 10 years ago now, no, 20 years ago now,
20, I was going to correct you.
When I wrote Our Gods Wear Spandex, and I was, thinking about like this whole notion that this has become the new mythology, but I don't think it is, and it certainly isn't now. And we're sort of in this weird period with the X-Files where it's sort of exhausted itself, right? And it's in this like limbo. And this has happened with so many works of art, books, movies, bands, whatever. There's always like a sort of a cycle where you're hot and you sort of reach that fever pitch, and then you sort of almost like crash, and then you sort of come up, there's almost like this peaks and valleys kind of rhythm that you get into. I think one of the reasons that I wrote the book is that I do feel strongly that in a few years, people are going to rediscover the show and go, oh, well, no, this is the mythology. This
Yeah.
is our modern mythology. Um, this, and you can make the argument that it's, a very time tested and true sort of trope of the occult detective. I mean, Dion Fortune was writing books about occult detectives, right? I mean, that's not a new phenomenon, but sort of interrogating the unknown, interrogating the paranormal, interrogating the mystical is probably the best that we can do. I mean, we'll never get those definitive answers, but just the idea that you apply yourself to trying to figure it out, I think that's like, it's almost like the sweet spot. That's where you want to be, because if you figure out the answers, you have nothing to look forward to. You have nothing else to look for, right?
Yeah.
But if you're on that path, it's like the chase. The chase is better than the catch with these kind of things, and that I think is going to be an archetype. The archetype of the seeker is going to be, I think, more powerful in the days to come. And one of the reasons being is that we're really at the tail end. I say this all the time, I've been saying this for years, but we're really at the tail end of like the age of medical and scientific and technological wonders.
Yeah.
The low-hanging fruit has all been picked, right? I mean, it's, the returns are diminishing to the point of vanishing. Right. And I mean, I've been talking about this for over 10 years. I was writing about this like 2014, and people was like, what the hell are you talking about? I think people are really starting to understand that now. We're not going to the moon. We're not going to Mars. We're not going to have flying cars and jet packs, that we'll take to school. Things are kind of as good as they're going to get right now.
Yeah.
Particularly in the realms of science and technology. And I think it's almost inevitable that we're going to start to backslide, because that always happens. I mean, you study history. I remember Graham Hancock, when it was, I don't know if it was Fingerprints of the Gods, but I remember he was doing this whole thing, and he's like, well, look at the Great Pyramid, how magnificent it is. And then you're like, one of these crappy mounds of bricks and sand, and it's like, in 100 years they went from like, this magnificent thing to this pile of crap here. Well, you can see how that happens now. What's the whole thing? Well, like, fortunes never last, what is it, like 2 or 3 generations.
Yeah.
There is almost like a built-in degenerative aspect to technological success, particularly of the level that we've seen. I wouldn't say that is a through line in the X-Files. I don't know if Chris Carter thinks that way. I think he might still have that kind of baby boomer, 60s, New Frontier, JFK, Apollo moon landing, even though it seems like he did wake up to the whole Apollo moon landing thing. But it's something that I think is going to be continue to be a very, very serious problem for us. And how are we going to incorporate that into our understanding of the world? The fact that like flat Earth became such a big thing about like 10 or 12 years ago. Who could have seen that coming? Weren't those questions all answered by like orbital platforms and space rockets to the moon. I mean, shouldn't we have evolved? Like, why are all these like kind of science nerds or whatever, skeptic types, why are they engaging still to this day with flat Earth on Twitter and so on? Like, why hasn't that been settled? Because the things that we thought were settled science really aren't. And that is going to be like almost like the next frontier. Like, how are we going to make sense of all the faulty and false assumptions that we made that were made for us, really, about science, about reality, about the nature of reality, about the nature of existence, about our purpose in this world? All those things are going to need to be rethought. And that's why I think shows like the X-Files and others like it are going to be, I think, more germane, I guess you would say, like
Yeah.
more relevant.
Joseph Campbell said that a myth is a story that makes us transparent to the transcendent. And the X-Files does that, right? Like, it's a story that makes the sanctity, the holy diversity, God, whatever, more transparent to you. And when you said that the X-Files is going to be the new mythology, I agree completely. And I like that you focused on the occult detective. Arguably, Heracles is that archetype, right? Like going and having a monster of the week encounters, trying to learn about it.
Yeah,
Like, truly.
the ultimate monster of the week characters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I see, and this is obviously my own projection, which is very X-Files anyway, I think you're completely correct, because what I see coming back is that is using a mythological or archetypal frame or framework to situate ourselves in a cosmos that we're not ever going to fully understand. Like, it actually, some of the X-Files implications almost remind me of Shakespeare, because in the right educated hands in Shakespeare's day, they're talking about, I see Queen Mab has been with you. They're talking about these Greek gods and oh, I am Fortune's fool. And they mean Fortune as a goddess of like good and bad fate. Like, they have this way, and nevertheless they're Christians. So they're not out there like, I don't know, worshiping Fortune, but they have these stories that allow them to like operate correctly in the cosmos. And that's there in the X-Files. That's like, this is, and it's there in the stories, and it's there in how it was put together, because Chris Carter, as you know, when you write about it in this book, it's like, no, these stories are mythic in the sense of they are contemporary expressions of mythical reality. And I do think that's like, I'm saying the same thing you are, but almost like focusing on the monsters. But I think you're correct. I think we move after this like fourth Fortean turn, whatever you want to call it. I think we move into a world where we do start using deep stories to situate ourselves humbly of what we can and can't know in the cosmos. And that's in the X-Files. That's what I see in the X-Files anyway.
Well, I think there's an important word to remind ourselves of here. An operative term is mystery.
Yeah.
And mystery is something that we don't like. Even though we crave it. Like, we crave it, but we resent it. We crave unknowing. We crave, like again, virgin territory. We crave to enter worlds that we're not familiar with and discover. We need that sense of discovery. We need that sense of unfamiliarity of the exotic, which becomes harder and harder to find in a world where there are, surveillance cameras every 20 feet in every major city, where we have these surveillance devices that we keep in our pockets. Some people have them on their wrists now, right? So the whole thing of mystery, of unknowing, like I have a copy of The Cloud of Unknowing on my bedside, and I find it very, I don't want to say inspiring, but maybe almost more comforting, that we need to not know things. It's like you want to believe, but that automatically implies that you don't know, right? Because you want it, you don't believe, right? You want to believe. You have that sense, that need to find things to believe in. but you're searching for them. You haven't found them. And again, that's why I think that this is a very powerful allegory for the times ahead, for the times that we face. So how many people are going to pick up on that? Very, very few. But those are the people I'm interested in interacting with. Those are the people I'm interested in reaching. The people who know enough to know that they don't know, and believe enough to know that they want to believe, but they don't really believe. I mean, where is, what's the dividing line when you cross over from non-belief to belief? Like what brings about that transformation? And these are all questions that people have forgotten how to ask, I think. I mean, these are questions that, 10 o'clock in your dorm room, smoking a few bowls with your friends, you just automatically go to like what you don't know, and how do you know what you don't know, and how do you get to where, a place where you can know what you don't know. I mean, all these kind of like circular kind of aphorisms, right? It's that weird stoner ontology, right? and that's something that we've lost. We've lost that, and that's why I think that things have, in so many ways, have gotten so crude. I think that so many of us are disillusioned because we crave mystery. We crave to unknow. We crave to seek after things that will always elude us. At the same time, we resent them because they do elude us. But we need that. I mean, that is at the basis of who we are as human beings, right? We have these curious, restless brains. And who is it? I think C.S. Lewis said something really interesting. He said that, mankind will always reach this sort of plateau where the problems are solved, and the people are immersed in the good, the beautiful, and the true. But then they get bored with it. It's almost human nature that when things get too good, we get bored with it. We get restless. We want to find something else. And I think a lot of people, video games and vaccines and all the rest of it, bad food, have erased that or almost negated that sense of longing for the mystery, for the unknown. But I'm hoping that there are still enough of us left. There's still enough of us left who are seekers, but realize that the search that's the ride.
Yeah.
The resolution of the mystery is sort of like where you get off the roller coaster, right? That's the last stop on the train. We want the train to keep on going, so we have to constantly be asking ourselves bigger questions and looking at bigger mysteries and sort of throwing ourselves into completely unfamiliar worlds. But without that, I think we reach the point we are now where everything is almost like turning in on itself. I feel like we're almost worldwide into this slow motion process of implosion.
Yeah. The exploration of the mysteries is what, quote unquote, the X-Files is about. But the show itself also is one. And I was reading this book and it reminded me of a not great biography of Sir Peter Jackson that nevertheless tells a really improbable story, which are these two old hippies from the edge of the world who are famous for like a rude puppet movie end up with like the jewels of English literature that and if it had been anyone else, anywhere else, at any other time, those Lord of the Rings films would have been Monty Python. And like they aren't.
Like they are today.
Yeah. But they're improbable. Like this should not. What? How does it? How? I'm so grateful that we have them. But when you look at the X-Files, it's like it is a show that explores the mysteries via a archetypally matched, sexually tense, like bisexual icon FBI duo. What is? And I love that about it. When at the beginning of the episode when you said, I was talking to Frank Spotnitz and he said sooner or later the show became about the show. I thought he meant, because one of my impressions of the, let's just say, flawed return seasons was like, you have to account for the existence of the show. Like the show has to become a little bit about the show. It's like, what, did that just happen? Did we just like move culture and do 9/11 before anyone else? And like fucking all these things. To some extent, the show has to be about the show because it was culture and a culture shift. And I think that like Lord of the Rings is the same, like the cosmos chose to express this. And that's the X-Files to me. What do you think?
Well, I'm so grateful. I remember, I don't know if it was before or after the films were made, but I remember like when I heard that they were going to do the films, I was thinking, all right, they're going to get like Morgan Freeman to play Gandalf, and they're going to get Keanu Reeves to play Aragorn. They're going to just totally Hollywood up. I'm sure Whoopi Goldberg will be in there somewhere, and it broke all the rules. And of course, the rule book came back with a vengeance with the Rings of Power, right? When it ends up in corporate Silicon Valley hell world. We are so great, we should be so grateful. We are so lucky that there was this weird moment in time when, Peter Jackson is down in New Zealand. God knows what he's doing. Nobody he knows what he's doing. I mean, they probably didn't even see the actual rough cut of the film until they were all shot, right? And I would maybe argue that the Hobbit movie sort of undid that as well. But it gets back to what I was saying about, with those early seasons of the X-Files. I mean, it was some little science fiction show on at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, who cares? I mean, back in the 90s, it was on Fox, Fox wasn't even a real network back then. I mean, it didn't even have a full week's worth of programming, right? So that's when the interesting things happen. I know we talked about Stranger Things, and it's like I honestly believe that Netflix wasn't really paying attention to what those guys were doing, because I don't think they really had any expectations that that thing was going to become the phenomenon it became. And was I talking to Greg? I think I was talking to Greg about this, because this is based on conversations that you and I had a long time ago, where it's like after they spilled the tea, they get to talk. It's like, no, we're not doing this anymore. When you guys are stepping on sacred ground here. We can't have this. We can't have you talking about MK Ultra and kids and all the rest of it, and and all the implications embedded in that show. Let's just say, it's when that's the really exciting thing, when they have the budget to work with, but they don't have like the suits breathing down their neck, and those moments are becoming rarer and rarer. But that's sort of like, that's the Goldilocks zone. When you have the budget, you have the exposure, but you don't have, the notes, the constant notes, and so on. You have a bit of latitude for exploration. Now, I kind of feel like we should be at that point again, with people can make movies on their phones now. We should have that kind of freedom, but do we have the will? Do we have the will, or are we just also pacified and almost narcotized by the technology that we should be using to tell each other new stories? But maybe that's just not the point we're at right now. We're just, whatever process is playing out now, we just have to ride it out. But the other thing too
I just would want to say that, because like the other thing I remember thinking about this when I studied Twin Peaks at university was we don't feel like we belong to one culture anymore. So like an event like Twin Peaks or the X-Files doesn't happen to one culture. So where we have no attention span, none of that stuff. But there's nothing for it to happen to because we're so tribalized into whatever it is.
Anatomized, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So there's nothing. It's not even just that media consumption has fragmented into millions of little screens. It's that there's actually no culture for an event to happen in anymore. So you can't
Mm.
move culture with, and that's a fourth turning thing. Like I agree. It's like we actually have all the technological capacities to be telling big and beautiful stories to each other, and all I can hope is that we're telling millions of little ones because there's no medium for the for the show to move through, I think.
Well, I think that the most resonant stories, and getting back to Lord of the Rings, um, are really addressing the same questions that our religions ask, or used to ask. Maybe not so much anymore. I think the most powerful, engaging, and lasting stories are the stories that are picking up the ball that was kind of dropped by organized religion. And clearly Tolkien was very devout Catholic, and that informed Lord of the Rings. Like you can't remove that kind of Anglo-Catholic traditionalism from those even from the films. Certainly not from the books. And then the same can be said for C.S. Lewis with the whole Narnia thing. And now, like, I forget who did some dopey one of these dopey Hollywood bimbo types is going to be doing like the new Narnia film, and I'm just whatever. But the most resonant stories are the stories that either come from that context or enter into that context. Like Chris Carter was raised as a Baptist, so he had a fairly traditional, fairly serious religious upbringing, and then he discovers science, and his brother becomes a professor at MIT. So science becomes sort of the new religion. But can science answer those questions that we asked of religion? I don't think so. And as I said, I mean, I think that our faith in science is going to be shaken continuously for the rest of our, you and I, our lifetimes. That is something we just need to get used to.
Do you
So
think
I think that
Christianity comes off like
go ahead.
I'm sitting like so Scully's the smart one and she's Christian.
Catholic, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think? Because I'm sitting with this. There's something about the Carterian cosmology that's very Jeff Kripal, Esalen, and the Religion of No Religion. Like it's very West Coast, late 20th century America, but it's also quite respectful of a Christian heritage. And I think that's interesting. Like I
Mm.
think Christianity comes off the best out of like all the possible religions, even as a map in it. And that strikes me as very Esalen light. Like it's we don't really know what's going on. These stories are imperfect, but are probably pretty good. And there's a Esalen-isness in there somewhere. I don't know.
Well, again, it's we need to ask these questions. Um, we need to ask these questions of like, why are we here? Where are we going? Where did we come from? What does it mean? Um, these are questions that maybe really hardcore mystics will solve to their satisfaction, but for most of us, it's these things are left dangling, and that to me, that's part of our. I don't want to say programming because that has a negative connotation to it, but it's like that's part of who we are. That's part of our sentience, let's just say. And when you look at the X Files, I mean, I went through great lengths to catalog all the similarities, let's just say, or the allegories to the ancient mysteries. Like how often the whole Orpheus and Eurydice myth is replayed in the X Files. That Mulder is Orpheus, and then Samantha, and then later Scully become Eurydice. And if you watch the first movie, it's so much. I mean, there's just, I'll just go on a limb here. There's absolutely no way in hell that he wasn't drawing on Orpheus and Eurydice, because it's like, she's bitten by the bee, right, instead of a snake, but then she's taken to the underground and he has to go rescue her in the underground, this buried spaceship down in Antarctica. I mean, the whole thing, it's almost like Orthodox mystery religion kind of stuff.
Well,
And
there's a
then
scene. He's literally pulling her out by her hand, like like coming out of the underworld. Which, by the way, Antarctica is the underworld for the planet. I'm with you. That's exactly what that movie is.
but those themes pop up again and again, and that to me is baked into the original, the original recipe. That's part, I think that Carter was definitely, latched on to Orpheus and Eurydice because it shows up in so many different contexts. And then when he kind of exhausted that mythos, then he gets into the Egyptian stuff, in the later seasons. And then when he sort of works past that, then he goes back to the Greek stuff, right? And then that episode, Babylon, where it's literal. I mean, talk about Orthodox mystery cult, right? Where you're literally going to the underworld and on the boat on the river Styx, right? To get the secrets from the dead, right? I mean, how very Greco-Roman. It's like, how much more explicit can it possibly get? And I remember when that episode aired, I said to you, it's like, I always feel like you wrote that episode for me. It's like, because I've been writing about that stuff since the beginning of the blog. I mean, 8 years before that episode aired, I was, drawing attention to all these parallels with the mystery cults. And there it is. It's like, yeah, well, it's no longer an issue. It's no longer a question. I mean, it could not possibly be more explicit than Mulder, taking these mushrooms and descending into the underworld, on the river Styx and all the rest of it. So, and then the whole thing with like Dionysus and everything, and the silent ones. I mean, it's all so granular in detail that I'll just put it this way. I have an extremely hard time believing that it's not completely intentional, that all this, stuff that, George Lucas and everybody were sort of pulling from Campbell, and Campbell was pulling from Jung, and Jung was pulling from whomever, right? I mean, maybe even Blavatsky at that point. So there is this kind of continuity. And that is primal. That is primal.
Yeah.
And even if people don't recognize it, even if people don't know these stories that they're drawing from, I feel that these stories, these old Greek myths, are just so embedded, not only in our culture, but almost like in our DNA. It's like certainly in our collective consciousness, collective unconsciousness, and all the rest of it. But it almost seems to me that like that stuff is part of us on a cellular level,
No, absolutely.
which
And
sounds a little pretentious, but
no. Because like when we actually used to teach people things, like in Shakespeare's day, assuming you were male, some money, they speak like that. And it was actually only recently. I think you did say this to Greg. It's like it's only in the last couple of decades that if you had money, like in England, you still go and do your PPE, you still go and do your philosophy aspect of your Oxbridge education, so that you can use these classical references. Like they are the structure of whatever quote unquote our culture is. And this comes back to why I think it's bigger than it was. Something Jordan Peterson said, speaking of 20 years ago, about that 15 years ago, that this woman, J.K. Rowling, was this single mother on the benefit, and she somehow tangled with the archetypes and became richer than the queen, like quite rapidly. And it's a vicious fandom doesn't know that it's nutritionally devoid of something that should never have been taken from them. which is this like deep medicine. And I think that's one of the reasons they go so fucking insane because they've like run on sugar and it's the first time they get actual like phytonutrients, but they don't know. They're not allowed to know that these things like are real. That like myth is cellular, as you say. Like, and these stories in particular are cellular, and it's one of the frames I have to understand. Like, how can you people be so awful? Like vicious fandoms. And it's like, I actually kind of get it. You are so nutritionally starved that you don't even know that you're missing these nutrients that are in this thing.
Well, I think a lot of it too is neurological, to be honest with you. Having been involved in fandom my entire life since I was in grade school, I got to know the neurology, let's just say. A lot of people who are drawn to fandom, I have this saying now that like all fandoms are toxic, really,
Mhm.
because they are basically collections of people who don't really have anything going on in their lives outside of the fandom. Um, People who have a lot of frustrations, people who have, a profound feeling of dissatisfaction with their lot in life. And they bring all that baggage into the fandom. And they get very resentful. I mean, this is something that I've noticed, not just in this, but, also like Star Trek, Star Wars, which are obviously very heavily mythologically, you what's even the term I'm looking for? I mean, it's like the mythology is clearly baked in, to the storylines, particularly with Star Wars, obviously. Right? But people get very uncomfortable when you start bringing that stuff up because, first of all, they're angry that they didn't see it first, right? That they didn't recognize it. But, so they feel like their favorite thing is fooling them. It's making a fool of them. Like it's saying things to them in a language they don't understand. But they should understand it because our schools should be teaching this stuff. Our schools should be teaching religion and mythology. I mean, not even in the sense of like a catechism, right? But just in the sense that you should know these stories. People used to know the Bible. People used to be familiar with the Bible. They could quote the Bible. Whether they believed it or not, they still had that framework, that sense of that these stories are meaningful to us, that these stories are at the foundation of Western culture and civilization. I mean, a great example, like Stanley and Jack Kirby, like these two secular New York Jews, raised at a time when they went to school and they were taught this stuff. I mean, Jack Kirby knew the New Testament. He knew the Bible. He knew things outside of the Torah or the Hebrew Bible. And that used to be something that most people did. I mean, they didn't necessarily believe it. And maybe most of them didn't, but they were familiar with it. They understood that these stories had a power, that these stories had moved mountains and built temples and cathedrals and aqueducts and pyramids. I mean, these things were all driving, you know, our entire civilization. And now it's all gone. It's all gone. And even like, I know there are a lot of people who are getting interested, or they say, in Christianity again, but it's all just politics to them. It's a way to slap on an identity onto their politics. It's not to understand that this is a text that has a certain meaning and a certain context and was written by certain people at a certain time, and we should understand like the way they thought and the way they felt and the way they described the world. No, it's just another identity to slap onto your politics. And we need to move past that. It's without myth and without religion and without the power of story, the power of narrative, I think everything falls apart. And I think that's one of the reasons why everything is falling apart. And you
Absolutely.
talked about Twin Peaks. I mean, Twin Peaks, I think 30 million people watched the first episode of that.
Exactly.
I mean, can
You
you
couldn't come to
imagine that
work the next
today?
day if you hadn't watched it. Don't go to work. They're gonna you'll be
Yeah,
fired. Like, what do you mean? You're not like
yeah,
not even small
freak.
business.
Yeah,
What were you doing?
yeah.
What, were you like out robbing? Were you burglaring? Like, why weren't you? Anyway, yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too because like the last expression we had of that, sort of the water cooler phenomenon, like in the 90s was Seinfeld and Friends and the X-Files and The Sixth Sense and, you know, Terminator 2. I mean, whatever. I mean, there were just certain stories that everybody knew, that everybody watched, that everybody was at least familiar with. And it was a kind of glue, it was kind of a social glue. At least like, you'd find yourself just sort of sitting in some room. Maybe you're applying for a job and you have to wait like an hour and there's just like a couple people there. It's just like you go, hey, did you watch that episode of Seinfeld last night or whatever? You had some sort of touchstone. You had some
Yeah.
sort of commonality that was part of our shared culture. We don't have a shared culture anymore. Um, will we be able to rebuild one? That
You're
that
gonna
remains to be
let,
seen.
let me know. Let me know what you think about this idea. So I'm so glad we got there, particularly with like Christianity and not knowing the Bible or archetypes and so on. I was thinking about this the other day. So a classic. I spent a bunch of time in Cusco this year, and when the Spanish showed up, and they're like, "How did you guys do all of this? Like the big mushroom pillar walls and that?" They said, "We didn't. We didn't do that. That's the Tiwanaku culture. What we call the Tiwanaku culture. Like we live in the ruins of stuff that we can't do anymore." And I think, and
Mm.
that's like a classic. When we talk about like cargo cults and like very Lovecraftian, like alien worship cults, it's usually crash technology that they can't build that they're working. But that's actually mythological. Like think about the demon possessed blue haired shit lib monsters that ruined Star Wars and Rings of Power. They think they think they're doing the same thing, but better, obviously better because they are better
Mm.
than
Yeah.
Tolkien or whoever. And they're actually just like playing in the ruins of mythological architecture, like it's the Jungle Book. And that's really interesting to me. Like when you say, I don't know if we'll get it back, it's like I think we have a ruined cargo cult relationship to mythology for this interregnum because we're like living in it, thinking we're doing it. The people, Kathleen Kennedy and her coven, think they're doing Joseph Campbell's Star Wars and they're not, and you can't tell them, and that's so like fast. Anyway, what do you think about my mythological or archetypal cargo cult frame?
Well, I think like Planet of the Apes is a good
Yeah, which was
good metaphor
playing
there.
on the episode I watched. So in Sein und Zeit or Closure in Mulder's
Oh, right,
room.
your closure, yeah.
Yeah, it's playing, and it's exactly like you don't want to. It's a scene where it's like, don't go and look. You might be upset at what you find.
Yes,
This is a
yes.
Carter. That's Carter to a T. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
So when I was a kid, this me and a friend of mine used to play in the ruins of this factory called Michigan Abrasives, and the Monadic River like actually just flowed right through these ruins, and we would like play Planet of the Apes and everything like that. And this was like literally a block away from where Sacco and Vanzetti went down, so there was a lot of history there. But neither one of us had ever seen that factory. We had no experience with the factory. We had no idea, like, I don't think we even had an idea of what they made or what they did there or, anything like that. We just knew the ruins. And I see that, and also playing Planet of the Apes, but I sort of see that, as a metaphor for what is going on in the culture. So you talk about like these weird woke weirdos that basically destroyed every single franchise that they touched and basically put the entire movie industry out of business. Everybody I talked to from Los Angeles is like, you have no idea what a ghost town it is. Nothing is going on. Everybody, all the stores are closed. Everybody's moving out. There's no work for anybody. And a lot of it could be because, we just basically exhausted all our stories, but a lot of it is also because of these people who came in thinking that they were going to do this right. And they
Meta.
said this over and
It's
over again.
Luciferian. It's Gnostic. It's
It
they
is,
think
yeah.
they're
And it's like,
better.
yeah, we're doing this right. You did it wrong. We're gonna tell these stories the way they're supposed to be made. Um, None of them read. None of them have interesting life experiences. None of them have suffered. They're all rich kids who grew up on their phones and probably never read like an actual book in their lives. So they have nothing to say. So all they can do is just sort of paste their identities over it. And, it's the same thing with like what you're talking about with like what was it, Tiwanaku, or what was the
Tiwanaku, yeah. So like the ruins, the good ruins, let's say in Cusco, were not made by the Inca. They just lived in the valley, but they knew that. They weren't pretending that they made it. Like we actually used to be better, I would say, at living in ruins. I think about that with I think about that with Roman Britain. So if you're going from Londinium to Bath, you would pass by the giant stones. You would pass by Stonehenge. No one alive knew who did that. Like
mm,
that was just
mm.
mystery because it's too old and it's enormous and it's like probably giants, which is why it was the giants dance. But like we used to live better in mysteries. The difference with these Kathleen Kennedy witches is that they think they're better. They think they know how to do
They
it
all are
better
witches
without
too. I
looking
mean,
at
literally witches. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So, I mean, that's why it's incumbent on anybody who cares to become the custodian.
it. Agreed.
It's like it's up to us, people who know the difference. It's up to us to become the custodians of these traditions. It's very, we're like the monks in the Dark Ages monasteries, who are keeping the lights on, who are keeping these texts, from rotting away and being forgotten. That's that's if you're looking for like an archetype to sort of latch on to that's going to give your life power and meaning. I mean, just think of yourself the way those early medieval, late Dark Ages monks saw themselves. I mean, they literally saw themselves as the protectors. And even though, I mean, it's questionable whether or not they, things like Ovid. I think they probably had a lot more interest and maybe even a lot more belief in say some of these late Roman texts than we've been led to believe. We're all propagandized to believe that the Middle Ages was just basically like the Taliban writ large, which
No,
is
it
just
wasn't. No, no, no. No.
absolute foolishness. I mean, we're just taught so much nonsense about the Middle Ages and so on. But in like what they call the High Middle Ages, starting in the 11th century, um, all these classical texts, what they call the Hellenistic texts, were not only rediscovered, but they were being taught again. They're like, no, there is value in this. There's value in Ovid. There's value in the Odyssey. There's value in Homer. There's value in all these ancient stories. We don't have to believe, because it's pretty much an open question whether the ancients really believed in those stories or just basically saw them as metaphorical themselves. But it's just like, we don't have to teach that you should worship Zeus or Athena or Hercules or whatever. But these stories have value because these stories are basically the substructure beneath Christianity, particularly the Catholic traditions. As I get older, it's like I appreciate like the Catholic mentality, like that long view of history that I don't think anybody besides the Vatican takes anymore. Right?
Yeah.
Nobody sees that, this has happened before. This will happen again. This too shall pass. We need some of that. We need that goes beyond the immediate.
Yeah.
Just whatever
So, Brother
whatever
Christopher,
types of.
I'm going to put, yeah, I want to give, like,
Go
take a
ahead.
left turn here. Um, I have never watched all of Millennium. And
Mm.
in the description, obviously, because it's a Chris Carter show, who's one of the talk about like running so other people could work. The other '90s showrunner who had a show that no one cared about, who ended up running 3 shows and it didn't really work out. Joss Whedon, same kind of idea. Like even an uber genius can't really handle that kind of workload. But here's a thought experiment. if you are tasked with remaking Millennium, because I didn't realize, because I stopped, like I've never seen all the episodes, and I'm going to correct that from next week. How would you make Millennium like good? I didn't realize there was like, because you can make it a story almost like a very Joseph Farrell story of like a of the syndicate being thousands of years old. Like, do you know what I mean? How would you do
Mm.
Millennium now? Because it seems like
Well,
what a
I
missed
think
opportunity. Like Lone Gunman wasn't a good idea. Millennium, it seems
no,
like
Lone Gunman was awful.
yeah, Millennium seems like it could have been good.
Well, Millennium was good. It's just not fun. It's a very harsh and unforgiving show. I remember Umberto Eco back in the '90s talked about how what was the he said that like Microsoft DOS was Protestantism and Apple was Catholicism, and the implication being is that working in DOS was hard and unforgiving, and when you made a mistake you usually had to start again, and Apple was just like, oh, here's a little icon, click on this icon, you can do whatever you want. It's just like he likened it, he called it like the mother church, and that is like X-Files is like the mother church, as Millennium is like DOS. I mean, Millennium is a very Baptist show. I mean, it's very Baptist. It's very obviously very apocalyptic, but it also takes an extremely dark, uh, I would say even Calvinistic view of human nature. That human nature is fallen. It's irredeemably fallen, and left to its own devices, it will always reach its lowest possible expression. And the only salvation are people who are willing to literally sacrifice themselves to fight back, to fight back against this degeneration. So it is a very hard show to watch. I mean, Carter was his primary influence was Seven, right? David Fincher's Seven. That was like the vibe he was going for. But it's like Millennium, it's almost like you can't even imagine that, like, the stuff that they would get away with putting, like, Carter had such juice that he could just put this stuff on TV that like would get an NC-17 rating at the movies. But it is like, it's about, it's essentially about that the world is unsustainable. It's just inevitably rushing toward its own demise. And the only salvation are people who are willing to sacrifice themselves. You talk about the Millennium Group. But even the Millennium Group, I mean, with each season of Millennium is basically like a different show, because it had different showrunners, like Carter and Spotnitz ran the first season, and Jim Wong and Glenn Morgan ran the second, and then Chip Johannesson and Ken Horton ran, and each one of them had very different views of the world, basically. And it became like this almost like very Masonic thing. But, as I say in the book, I think they were kind of lifting. There was a show called Poltergeist: The Legacy, and like that version of what they call the Millennium Group was very much riffing on that. But then in the third season, it's been like, well, there are all these serial killers running around in the show because they're being programmed. They're being programmed by the people who say that they're going to save us from them. It's classic problem, reaction, solution. And I think they might have even used that phrase once or twice. I mean, when you talk about hardcore conspiracy, it doesn't get any more hardcore than that last season of Millennium. But even like the other, there's a lot of stuff in the second season as well, that it's just like they were just digging in, like this stuff taken from like Michael A. Hoffman. You know what I mean? There's an episode that's kind of riffing on Kathy O'Brien and Transformation of America. They were really getting into, and it was the same thing because very few people were watching it, and Fox just gave up on the show long before, and they were just putting out all this stuff that, like, I can't even believe that they were putting on, like stuff that are just coming straight from alt conspiracy, right? I mean, like hardcore, grim, unforgiving stuff. So it is a difficult show, and it's not. I don't think it's a show that wants you to like it.
Yeah.
It wants you to listen to it, but it doesn't care whether you love it or not. It's going to tell you what it has to say, and I kind of admire that purity. It's it's a bold strategy. Let's see if it works out for them. That whole
Well, it
that
kind
whole
of didn't.
meme.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, in some ways, I mean, Carter pulled the plug on that show because it just reached a point where he realized that it was never going to go past a certain point. Like the audience was never going to grow significantly past what it had become. And then he did that terrible Harsh Realm show, which is so influenced by Hobbes that one of the characters is named Hobbes, right? So, and that's getting even more into like very, very deep pessimism that this virtual reality technology is only going to empower the worst of us. But that's also a very Cartesian worldview, is that technology does empower the worst of us. And the more powerful the technology, the worse it gets.
Yeah. It struck me that I'm going to watch it, but there's sort of a missed opportunity there. One of the things Catherine Austin Fitts says about like the Anglo-American elite or Mr. Global or whatever is like it's not technically obvious what risk they're managing. Like we don't know. It's thought experiments. Like is it like the syndicate where they're like, oh, actually we're 2 years out from an alien invasion, so we need the digital ID and whatever. Like there's something you could do with the Millennium Group there where it's like you don't actually know what risk they're managing, and it'd be very Cartesian for it to be like wrong. But it just seemed like this idea of a very old organization that's either trying to bring about, it's not clear, bring about or get mankind through an apocalypse event, and that's always been its job. It's like there's a good story there that like for the 5-episode Netflix reboot. Yeah.
I don't even, but I think it's kind of passe, and it almost seems like a very boomer mentality. Oh, there's got to be somebody somewhere that's got an eye on the ball. Do
The
we
plot
still
twist
think that
being
way?
that like they don't, like that's where I think
Yeah.
you can, but that's like the syndicate is the moral of the syndicate is that you can have unlimited money and the military industrial complex and you'll still lose. You'll still come up second and essentially be scammed by the off-planet partner. Like you just can't do it, and that's really X-Files. And I was just kind of wondering if you could do almost like the Venom version of that with Millennium, where it's like, well, what if you could? And yeah,
But again, I mean, we just don't think that way anymore.
yeah.
Like we're not expecting the cavalry to ride in, unless you're a Q person and trust
Sure.
the plan and the white hats and
Yeah, but
patriots
I
are in
almost jumped
control
in
and
when you
everything.
said like it's going straight from alt conspiracy to Millennium. It's like, yeah, now it goes straight from alt conspiracy to the president's Twitter feed. Like you actually didn't even
Yes,
see the show.
yes, yes. But no, but I think this whole see, I always disagree with Catherine Austin Fitts and Joe Farrell. I mean, not because I don't respect them, because I respect them tremendously, but I don't think there are all these great reserves of hidden technologies in some deep underground military base. I used to think that way.
Same.
I don't think that way anymore. I think we reached the terminal point.
Yeah.
The ride is over. The glory days are over, and we're going to have to deal with diminished capacity and a competency crisis. That there aren't all these wonder weapons or EM drives or whatever hiding somewhere. They're going to just solve all the problems. Like just not even solve all the problems, just make the problems irrelevant because we're going to Mars. Like we're not going to Mars. We're never going to Mars. Nobody's going to sit in a tin can for 9 months to go to Mars. It's just never going to happen. Um, you know, you and I used to talk about the EM drives, and then it just sort of quietly was
Well,
admitted that they don't exist.
yeah, but what I suspect is in all those mothballed underground bases is failed wacky attempts to do it. I have no doubt that they spent a lot of that missing 21 trillion or whatever it is on zany attempts, but the worldview is wrong. Like this is even Peter Thiel said that it's like we sort of got to the end of what we can do with this worldview, right? And it is that better living through chemistry boomer worldview, and I'm sure there are half built, don't work EM drive flying saucers with Raytheon on the side, and I'm sure they're still asking for money. It's like I just need a few billion more. So, but I just kind of feel like the last few ops would have gone better if they were more competent with their super science skills, and like mRNA would have done something. But like, no, you're dealing with boomers still thinking it's a silver age, and it's not. So I agree with you. But then there's like these weird moments of people who aren't in that orbit, not necessarily deep underground bases, but there are trustworthy people who are like, oh yeah, aliens like literally live among us as humans. And it's like, I don't know. And I'm not saying maybe they're right. I'm saying like, it's really X-Filesian to be like, I don't know what's happening. Like, I know it's not that, but I don't know what's happening. And that's good.
Well, the UFOs I've seen, either just couldn't possibly be structured craft. And then that one that I sort of live streamed to you, live blog to you back in 2017, which didn't look like it was part of our reality entirely. Like it was kind of in our reality, but it was outside of it. And that's something that Keel was talking about back in the 60s, right? So I definitely believe that we are under the influence, let's just say, of an intelligence outside of ourselves that isn't necessarily benevolent. Um, it's like detailed at great length in Lucifer's technologies. But are we going to be able to use that? I don't think so. I mean, are we going to be able to use that? I don't think whatever intelligence is behind us, I don't think they're abducting us. I don't think they care about us. I mean, they might be somehow interfacing with us neurologically or whatever, whatever the possible means of communication might be, but I don't think they give a damn about us one way or the other. It's the same way like you would find some technology where you could communicate with an anthill, but would you care about those ants? Would you develop some sort of affection towards them? No, you'd be like, you'd probably think they were even more horrible than, when you really got to look at how they operate. And, I mean, ants can be pretty brutal creatures, to be honest with you. You wouldn't worship them, and you wouldn't, it's just, we have a lot of notions that were programmed into us through science fiction that we need to just let go.
Agreed.
We have to, and I, every time I look at, I mean, I have Elon Musk on mute, but every time I see his posts on X, I'm just like, you still think that it's like the 80s and science fiction is real. It's like you never got past the fact that this was all propaganda, for particularly for social engineering purposes. And this stuff is never going to, nobody is going to Mars. I'm just going to lay down my marker right now. And Trump is talking about Artemis again. And it's just like, I remember like 15 years ago when Obama was talking about the Constellation program that just mysteriously got canceled. I mean, it's not even like a carrot that we're chasing. It's just sad now, Yeah. I mean, it's just this weird, sad relic of a golden age that most people have no memory of,
I think the only thing that of value of like the Cold War efforts, like a Cold War attempted breakaway civilization, is the narrative itself, because they're rolling it out like with a lobotomized amnesiac version of ufology over the last 10 years, where it's like, oh, look at the tic tac, and let's all listen to actual Pentagon employees. It used to be this. You in the book, you talk about conspiracy culture in the 90s, and the 90s are not anymore. Like they whatever they did, it kind of, I think the most valuable thing that they got out of the trillions that were spent trying to make little flying saucers is like, well, let's use this story as itself a weapon, right? Air cover for. It's almost like rehabilitate. Well, it is. It's rehabilitating the reputation of the very people who did all that horrible crap in the last century in lead up to war. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up though, because it's like very quietly a few months ago, it just sort of came out like, oh, well, all this stuff about disclosure and these whistleblowers, and it was all just cover for secret military projects,
What a
which
shame.
it's always been,
Exactly.
which it's always been. And, the very first episode of the X-Files past the pilot, which is called Deep Throat, is about exactly that, that UFOs are being used for cover for secret aircraft. Um, and that, when I sort of get into my X-Files theory of everything, uh, became very, very important. And it was very gratifying to me to have sort of the benefit of this very quiet, fast, fast vanishing revelation that, oh, yeah, this is just covering for whatever Lockheed or Raytheon or whomever are messing around with up there. Um, how many television programs, popular television programs, would dare put that kind of story on the air? But this is what I argue in the book is like, you can watch that entire series and think there are no aliens.
Yeah.
That because of the unreliable narrator and point of view storytelling, we never really see them too clearly. It's always just these fleeting glimpses, right? And is that just delusion? Is that just expectation? Is this just hallucination? Um, I think that is a much more interesting story than, that aliens are here and they're colonizing us and all the rest of it. Um, that kind of uncertainty. One thing that I've always said is that to me, the most effective stories about the paranormal give you a plausible counter argument.
Yes.
Okay. So, and I don't know why, I don't know what it is, but it's like if you're watching a story about UFOs or ghosts or monsters or whatever, and there is, your Scully giving you a very plausible and rational counter argument against the fact, oh, this is ghosts or monsters or UFOs, that gives you like an entry point because she's really the audience. Oh, come on. This can't be real. This is just, this is just nonsense. Because that's the way most of us are going to think, you know, particularly if we don't have those direct experiences. If somebody comes up to you and tells you about, oh man, you wouldn't believe it, I was abducted by aliens. I can't, it's like, oh my God, I was gone for a week. And then I came back and it was only 20 minutes. I'm like, I was gone for a week. How, saying like, you would just be like, okay, whatever, smoke another one, spark up another bowl, buddy. You need to have that plausible deniability to really make those kind of stories numinous. And I think numinosity, I used that term before, but I think that's a very applicable term because any movies, science fiction, horror, paranormal, whatever it is, the good stuff immerses you and you become part of it. It becomes like part of your reality. It becomes part of your experience. I mean, watching movies in the 80s. I was watching Aliens. I was watching the expanded edition of Aliens, which I'd never seen before. I mean, I love the movie Aliens, but I just felt like I was there. It's like it became so powerful and so convincing. And that's why I think, people like Elon Musk still think we're going to Mars, even though he probably knows better because he's been to Mars several times.
Yeah.
We've all been to Mars, right? We all watched The Martian and Mission to Mars and Red Planet and Santa Claus versus the Martians or whatever. We're all there together. I mean, we all had that shared experience of finding ourselves, in a galaxy far, far away. We all lived it together, and that is something that is very hard to move past. Even it's just
Well,
something that you can't just forget because you experienced it, and
agreed. Yeah.
you know,
The thing you're saying about leaving a plausible counter explanation. So the Yamanawa, which are an Amazonian nation, have a phrase "tsa yoshito yoshito," which is language twisting. And if you talk about the spirit world, you can't use direct, accurate language because the words crash into them. And so you have to come around. It has to be language twisting. You have to actually have a word container to not describe something directly so that it can be conveyed accurately. And Lynch and Carter, this is coming back to like being humble before the mysteries versus the people running Lucasfilm now. They know that. They have the obviously genius visual skills to be able to go, no, you can't just say that. Like, if you want people's spirit to experience whatever the fuck aliens are, you can't be like, oh, there's these little gray aliens and they're in a bunker outside Las Vegas. Like, you can't do that. You have to tell the whole story twisting. You have to actually, it lives in the half light, let alone the starlight. But like any sacred way of speaking about the numinous or the sacred, you can't. It can't be a scientific diagram or a menu. Like, it has to be twisting.
Well, our language is so inaccurate, and it's almost like it's self-defeating. You have those moments where like you're really high, but you figured something out. You've just come to this realization that is so powerful and so immediate, and then when you try to explain it or express it verbally, it just evaporates.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right?
And it's the same thing. It's the same thing with dreams too. I think the most powerful experiences that we have are beyond language. Language is a beautiful thing, and it's a wonderful tool, and we can't live without it. But it does have its limitations, and one of its limitations is that it can't describe the ineffable. It can't describe those experiences that we have that we can't draw comparisons to. We can't draw mundane comparisons to. And that's why I think that, music is so powerful, because music has the ability to express these, I don't want to say higher, because that's putting some sort of criteria on it. But music can express emotions or feelings or states of being that are beyond words. And, I'm sure you've experienced this with ayahuasca and all these other kind of things. It's just like I think in some ways the most powerful experiences and the most transformative experiences of our lives are things that we can't articulate, that they are beyond words.
In the Amazon, no, it was in the Andes in like 2022. There was a series of ayahuasca sessions where she was basically like, right, I'm going to teach you how dimensions work. And it was so self-evident. Like, oh, I'm going to come back. I'm going to be a genius. I'm going to tell everyone how dimensions work. Get down here. Like, my mind actually can't even get there anymore, right? But when you're actually in that medicine space, it's like, yeah, this is easy. Like, oh, of course it works like that. It reminds me, one day I'll write a book about this, because if you develop cultural protocols, you can get language to do something almost like what music does. So Owen Barfield, speaking of Tolkien, is one of the Inklings, and he developed a theory of language that we've actually gotten much worse at it over time. And when he was at university, he was translating Cicero. And there's a line in Cicero where Cato had died, and it said, Cato passed out of life. And he suddenly realized, like, that's more accurate to what happens than Cato died. Right. So the theory of language, the UG theory of language is like, one morning I wake up and hit my head on the top of the cave, and then the next morning my wife goes UG and I don't hit my head, and that's where language begins. But actually, if you look around the world at indigenous societies, their languages are better, and ours used to be better, and we've got shit at it, and like less accurate, because we don't appreciate this language twisting that you must use metaphor to talk accurately about the real thing, because there's this like metaphoric divide. So in the Amazon, when you're in dream space, everything that happens is literal. When you wake up, you must interpret it metaphorically because you're jumping back into the dimensions. That's how ritual works, right? Like, so you
Mm,
must have a metaphoric version of what you want to get that message to the spirit world. You can't just like have, um, if it's a love spell, it can't just be like, oh, here is like here is the woman that like it has to be Venusian and it has to be a metaphor for what love is to get across there. Music can do that. Language,
mm.
if you know that that stuff, if that realm is real, you're kind of humble again, and you're gonna try and make it work. And I think if maybe they would say it differently, but Lynch and Carter intuitively get that, like, if well, I'm going to convey mystery, it can't be factual, or it'll actually be worse than allegedly less accurate.
Well, Lynch to me is somebody who's so immersed in dream and always has been his entire life. I mean, all his movies, all his narratives are dreams,
Mm.
and they work on the language and the logic of dreams. Um, Carter can get pretty weird, but I always like some of these sort of high concept comedy episodes he does. I describe them as like, he's telling himself a joke that only he gets. It's like they're so strange, they're so weird, and like it's if it's almost like I don't want to say it's off-putting, but it's it is kind of intimidating because it's like what is he saying to me? It's like with Lynch, you know that he's conveying the logic of dreams, and he wants you to dream his dreams. I get the impression that he's somebody who has extremely vivid dreams his entire life, just in the same way that somebody like Lovecraft did. Like Lovecraft, to me, really understood nightmare. He understood the vibe and the feeling of nightmare. And people will always complain about his purple prose and everything, but it's just like he could probably write better than that. But he understood, he instinctively and intuitively understood that he had to sort of lapse into this very archaic language to express experiences and sensations that even at that point, even at the time of his writing, in the early 20th century, had already been forgotten.
Mm.
Had already been not even forgotten, but just like suppressed, like literally suppressed. Like, no, we don't think that way anymore. We don't talk that way anymore. We don't look at the world that way anymore. He always was talking about like he was this rationalist atheist and all the rest of it, which is just absolutely absurd. He was a man who was haunted by the gods, literally haunted by the gods. And that's what makes him, resonate to this day, even though this, the settings and the language and everything about it is archaic and outdated. But it's universal. And I think that Moore, Alan, we've talked about Alan Moore, we talked about Providence. Like Moore, I think, is a little too linear in his thinking. He's a little too, he's a little bit too much in love with words and has too much faith in the power of words to express the same kind of things that somebody like Lovecraft could do instinctually. But he at least was familiar with the territory. Um, these kind of stories the world has no time for anymore.
Mm. Yeah.
But it also doesn't realize how much it needs them, how much we need stories that we don't understand necessarily, but somehow we relate that we even, it's beyond relating to, it's like we connect to them, like we almost commune with them on a much different and deeper layer than, Friends or, The Sopranos or Alias or, whatever, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, whatever. I mean, there are certain types of stories, and I'm not saying any of those are invalid or anything. I'm just saying it's just a different kind of understanding of the world and a different kind of experience. And again, I think the experience is the key here. I think that Lovecraft, even though he was a shut-in and a weirdo and whatever, I think he had a lot of experience. We've talked about this.
Mm.
We have a dissenting view on his lifestyle, let's just say, and I think that caused him a lot of a lot of unhappiness, a lot of stress, a lot of fear. I think he was in a constant state of fear of discovery. And that informed his stories, Pickman's model. What was the other one? Hypnos. I mean, there was a number of Lovecraft stories where you can just tell that something's weighing on his mind that he doesn't want people to discover, right? And then he expresses it in ways that are nonlinear and allegorical and all these kind of things. And it's like you use the term allegorical now, and people almost get offended. And it's like, wait, there's a meaning to this story that I don't understand, because everybody is so narcissistic and cocksure these days, right? That they get offended if you suggest to them that there's something else going on, that they're not perceiving. I mean, they find that very insulting. Yeah. So again, like you asked me what I wrote this book for. It's like I wrote this book for my fellow monks. We are the custodians. We need more books like this. We need maybe books like about Tolkien or about C.S. Lewis, or about David Lynch or whomever. We need to keep these home fires burning until such time comes around again when people are ready to hear them. I mean, that could be 100 years from now. It could be 500 years from now. Who knows? But if we don't keep those home fires burning, who is? You know what I'm saying? So it's a burden, and it's not something that I would wish upon anybody. But it's like we are losing what it's like to be human, and a huge part of what it is to be human is our stories. And we need to keep our stories alive. And our stories are all dying. And this is something that even when I was working on this book, was really weighing on me. It's just like everything is dying. Star Trek is dead, Star Wars is dead, Marvel is dead, Doctor Who is dead. You name it, up and down the line. I mean, every one of these stories that gave people inspiration and in some ways gave their lives meaning is all been murdered. Like murdered. You know what I mean? Not just dead, murdered. Terminator. Every one of these big, aliens. They've destroyed the whole Alien franchise. We need these stories. We need stories like them, and we need. It's up to everybody, whatever handful of people are out there that this resonates with. We have to do this. We have to be the caretakers, right? The keepers of the flame, because those flames are going to be extinguished, and it's going to have an unbelievably destructive effect on not only our imaginations, but I think on the ability for human civilization to function. We need, the world doesn't run on electricity and plumbing and gasoline powered engines. The world runs on stories. The stories are really at the very basis of our humanity. And if we lose those stories, we lose our humanity, just by default. So.
Well, for people who, I was thinking as you were saying that, because I agree completely, there is power in the telling. So if you've got this far into the show and you've been always meaning to watch the X-Files, that's actually a revivification and contribution to the continuity of the field of these kind of stories. So if you're not ready to write the David Lynch book, because I was going to tell you to do that, Chris, at the end of the episode, David will be next.
Dude, you know how long it took me to just write this story, which I'm ridiculously familiar with. I'm trying to get the book out of the box.
Book out the show, everyone. Yeah. Because I think I'm very interested in the tending of fires. Let me say it this way. watch the X-Files from beginning to end because the stories have been murdered, but the plot twist is they've been murdered by like an angry demiurge who doesn't understand that stories themselves live in the starlight and like you can't actually kill them. They operate outside of time. So I agree completely. It was Rings of Power that made me realize, oh, it's making a play for all the medicinal routes into the future. It's cutting off all those routes through like the event horizon or whatever, right? But the trouble is, like, they're still alive back the other way. Like, you can't actually kill the X Files. You can just stop it. Same thing with like Tolkien. Like, you can still step into Middle Earth because the story is outside of time. So watch the X Files with Chris's book as a form of ceremony and tending to story. And there it is, XF Ultra. It was obviously I'm like a disgusting, gross fan of both Chris and the X Files. So I loved it. But grab the book and go episode. Read the beginning, then go episode, watch commentary, episode, watch commentary, because you want the surprise at the end about how dumb you are for not seeing what Chris sees when he sees the show.
Well, don't feel dumb because I mean you have to understand that for the past 30 years I'm actually ashamed to admit how many times I've watched some of those episodes. It's like in the high hundreds, so it's not something that I just like. Oh, I know what that is. Like this instant recognition. It's a period of years, and it really wasn't until I really studied, specifically the mystery religions, because the mystery religions are such a undercurrent and such a building block for all these their mythology, right? It wasn't until I really dug into till I really understood not only what the stories are, but what they meant to these people. And again, one thing that I just want to reiterate is like we need mystery. We need to have questions, maybe questions that we can't even answer. It sharpens our brains and our souls to pursue things, to pursue, because you will discover all these other things along the way, as I've done. Um, when you're in pursuit of trying to answer these questions, and I always feel like this, almost like this sense of emptiness, when I've sort of solved some of the problems, or figured things out, because it's just like, well, what do I have to look forward to now? We need mystery. We need, that cloud of unknowing. We need to not know things. We need to explore. We need to have things to look forward to. We need to have, just like the fact that, oh, you get up in the morning, it's like, oh, I'm going to work on that problem again, that vexing problem that's taken me years. It's like, but it gives your life meaning. It gives your life context. And without that, we're just like these floating bits of protoplasm, in a petri dish, just waiting to be extinguished. And so much of the world today has fallen into that, has accepted that. Particularly people in our art culture. They've just accepted meaninglessness. They've accepted this very false sense that there are no mysteries, that there are no things that we don't know, that we need to discover, that we need to find out. And I always think that like discovery and mystery, it's almost like an inexhaustible resource. It's something that renews itself, over the generations. I mean, we will find that some of the questions that we had, or some of the mysteries that we've been trying to solve, have already been solved, but maybe in ways that we didn't recognize, like we didn't understand the context or the language that these answers were given to us in. But that to me is like it's almost part of who we are as human beings. It's like a basketball player. You don't just like reach a certain plateau and then coast. You've always got to practice. You've always got to hone your skills, or they atrophy, right? And I think that with us, as and I'm saying collectively, I'm not exempting myself from this, but it's like we need to to hone ourselves against mystery. Mystery, I think, really gives us, like I said, a reason to get up in the morning. Without mystery, without unanswered questions, without goals of that nature, we just drift along. And how many people do you know that are just drifting along? That are just whatever. That it's just one drifting from one sensation to the next, from one amusement to the next. We can't live like that. I don't think our society can exist with that. And I think that if you look at how we've reached to the point that we've reached now, and maybe it is inevitable, maybe it's like this sort of Strauss fourth turning kind of thing. Maybe it's just going to be what it is. But we need to work against that. We need to resist it. We need to be the caretakers of stories. We need to be the caretakers of mystery, because nobody else. The cavalry is not coming. There isn't like some secret society up in the Andes Mountains or up in the Himalayas that's going to, ride to our rescue. Like the 9 unknown men, they don't exist. It's like the Templars aren't coming to make everything okay. We need to take responsibility for it ourselves. And what I choose to take responsibility for is stories, the power of stories. And the power of stories outside their narratives, because everything exists in a world, in a context. Everything comes out of an environment. You can't separate the stories from, the human ecology. They're not autonomous. They're part of us. And I think, when you talk about all these blue-haired witches at Lucasfilms or whatever, they don't have any context of that. It's just, well, I want to, do my self-inserts and, congratulate myself for whatever identity I've chosen. And that's not how stories live. That's how stories die. So.
All right. Well, for people who are intrigued and in the very unlikely event that they don't know where to find you, Mr. Knowles, where could they go? What's going on?
Oh, gosh. secretsun.blogspot.com, thesecretsun.substack.com, Secret Sun Speaks on Twitter. I'm just really waiting for it to go back to Twitter. I hate the name X. I hate the branding. I hate the graphics. It's just awful.
All right. And
I'm grateful. Let me just say this. I'm grateful that I was unshadow banned when Elon Musk took over, because I never realized how throttled I'd been. But,
it was briefly fun for a while after that happened. But I mean, if for people who are like, Substack is a clean way, you'll get everything Chris has got going on because there's announcing that. Substack, for however long it lasts, is, I think, the only interesting place that is.
It seems to be the last refuge. Yeah.
Long may that
the last
last.
redoubt.
Probably middle of next year. I don't know, but at least at the time of recording, Substack is the place. All right, so congratulations on the book, and thank you for reminding me of how just potent and transformative and deep and wild the X-Files is. So thank you.
And druggy. And druggy too. So don't forget druggy.
I never do.